A fiery shout rang out in front of the courthouse gate. "Someone like you has no right to step through this door." The police officer blocked the path directly, eyes flashing with contempt, as if ready to crush her on the spot. The crowd came to a halt. Some sneered, others pointed, turning the humiliation into a public spectacle. The black woman stood still, back straight, her eyes like cold blades slicing through the heavy air. And when she answered, her voice calm but cutting through the sky. "I know exactly where I belong. What truth are you so afraid of that you have to stand in its way?" The morning in the city center hung heavy under streaks of gray clouds casting a dull veil over everything. The road leading to the courthouse, usually bustling now, felt slowed, and even the sound of traffic seemed out of place in the thick air. Wind swept through the white stone pillars built in the last century, making the moss-covered patches tremble gently, as if time itself were tapping a cold rhythm down each step. The heavy iron gate stood slightly ajar, revealing a polished stone courtyard behind it, a place that had witnessed countless trials and oaths made beneath the national flag. The scattered crowd in front of the gate paid no mind to anyone until a black woman in a dark coat walked steadily toward the entrance, each step certain as though no cloud in the sky could shake her pace. At that exact moment, the tense silence was shattered when the guard's rough hand shot out, blocking her squarely at the chest. He was tall, built like a brick wall, his eyes etched with open disdain, not even trying to hide it. His voice hissed through clenched teeth, harsh enough to make any faint-hearted person step back. "Someone like you has no right to be here." The words struck the air like a blade hit in stone, turning the already heavy atmosphere into a slab of iron, pressing against the chest of every witness. Some passers-by turned in surprise, those in a rush now halted as if an unexpected drama had unfolded before them. In a few eyes, a flash of cruel excitement appeared, as though waiting for the woman to tremble or turn away. A small crowd began to gather, whispers mixing together, some even whistling, some sneering, while others looked on casually, as if enjoying a spectacle on the courthouse steps. The woman didn't move, her eyes fixed on the iron gate just a few steps away, now blocked by that rough hand like an impenetrable wall. Her back remained straight, her chin high, her posture calm like a pillar no force could shake. Amid the growing noise, her voice rang out steady, firm, not loud, but enough to cut through the murmurs. "I know exactly where I belong." That sound fell like a long, clear bell, freezing a few people in place. They hadn't expected someone facing such blatant humiliation to respond with such cold composure. The officer flinched for a moment, then narrowed his eyes, deep lines of irritation marking his face. He stepped half a pace closer, his massive frame blocking what little light filtered through the breaks in the clouds. His gaze swept over her from head to toe like someone sizing up a cheap item. His voice came out with half scorn, half challenge. "Where do you belong? You belong outside the fence, where the extras wait, not in here." His words cracked like a whip against stone, and the crowd fell silent for a few seconds before the murmurs swelled louder. People pointed fingers, some burst into gleeful laughter, as if watching a scene that fed their sense of power. The woman didn't turn her head. Her eyes stayed locked on the man before her, not angry, not mocking, but cold like the surface of a mirror. That calmness was the most dangerous kind of defiance. Inside the officer's mind, irritation rose fast. He was used to eyes that dropped to fear whenever others heard the threat in his voice, but this woman didn't flinch, not once, and that stirred something sharper in him, like his authority was being dismissed. He lowered his voice, but the tone sliced even harder, threat hanging in the air. "I made myself clear. Someone like you doesn't step through here. This gate isn't for people who flash their skin color for show. Step back before I give you something to regret." The threat dropped heavy as stone. Some in the crowd furrowed brows, others watched eagerly, hoping for either submission or a sudden spark of resistance. But no, the woman's silence weighed more than shouting. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze sweeping the crowd, then turned back to the officer, her voice calm, cutting through the clouds above. You think you're holding justice in your hands, but justice never stands with those who build gates to block people at the door. The words weren't only aimed at the man in front of her, they reached every person standing nearby, reminding them they were witnessing raw injustice. Some glanced sideways in secret, some swallowed hard truth burning too clearly to ignore, but too bold to say aloud. The atmosphere dipped thick with tension, like a wire pulled so tight it would snap with the slightest touch. The officer's face twisted, his teeth clenched, and the hand still raised now curled into a fist. He was holding back a surge of anger, but it was clear the fire had already caught. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he saw as beneath him. But the eyes staring back held firm like a wall, and he felt exposed, seen through, stripped bare. The sky hung lower, thick and heavy, pressing down on the small courtyard. Wind whipped through the columns, stretching the echo of humiliation sinking with the pounding hearts of those watching. The woman stood still, her gaze unshaken, her shoulders steady, untouched by the storm churning above. And in that moment, the line was drawn on one side, a gleaming badge flaunting authority on the other, a steady gaze that refused to yield. The entire courtyard pressed sound into every breath, into every soft shuffle of shoes from those standing nearby. The waiting grew heavy, as if everyone sensed they were witnessing the beginning of a much larger storm. The courthouse gate, once meant to symbolize justice, now stood as a false boundary built from arrogance and discrimination. The woman did not step back, the officer did not relent, and the air between them grew so tight that a single sharp breath could set everything off. The morning wind swept across the stone steps, carrying a chill that made every footstep strike sharp and loud, echoing off the towering white pillars. The black woman stepped forward, her composed stride a bold stroke of ink against the courthouse's bleak gray. But as soon as her foot touched the first stone step, a figure rushed in, blocking her path entirely. The officer charged up, boots striking the stone in crisp, heavy beats, a sound sharp enough to send a shiver through those nearby. He stopped right in front of her, hot breath thick with the sting of tobacco, his face carved with scowling lines. He moved in close, so close a flick of his hand could have reached her face, eyes narrowing to slits, spitting out words laced with venom. "You're just a shadow in black. Don't dream of standing as an equal." The words boomed across the courtyard, already locked in silence, and it hit the bystanders like shards of shattered glass. Some mouths dropped open, others curled into smirks as if they'd just witnessed a rare public humiliation. One even let out a sharp sneering laugh, a high-pitched sound that pierced the tension like a needle to stretched skin. The crowd's eyes lit up not with agreement, but with the scent of blood in the air, the kind of thrill crowds crave when someone weaker is pushed to the wall. The officer, clearly pleased with himself, lifted his chin and tapped hard on the badge over his chest. The dry clang of metal rang out as he grinned with smug pride. This law was written by us. That sound hit like a hammer on a scale, cold and full of arrogance. The murmurs grew louder. Some covered their mouths. Others quietly raised their phones, the glow of screens flashing like hidden eyes waiting to capture what came next. The woman stood her ground, her eyes deep like a still lake, yet so sharp they cut through every ounce of false triumph around her. She didn't respond right away, her breath steady, shoulders square, letting each passing second become its own quiet resistance. Then, suddenly, her voice rang out, not loud, but landing in every ear around. Law is not a weapon to spit in the people's face. Her voice carried like a blade, slicing through the space between the humiliated and the humiliator. The crowd froze, a few mouths hung open in disbelief at what they had just heard. An elderly woman near the fence clutched her purse, eyes glassy but silent, while a young man in a hoodie scrambled to raise his phone, fingers trembling as he hit record. The air suddenly felt lit from within, heat rising from the steps, threading through every breath, turning the once cold space into something tight and blazing. The officer's face flushed, red veins bulging across his forehead in fury. He was used to bowed heads, to obedient nods at the sight of the shiny badge on his chest, but now that cold, steel-edged voice struck directly at his pride, making him feel as if an invisible hand were tightening around his throat. He clenched his jaw, teeth grinding audibly, eyes blazing, and his voice came out hoarse as if echoing from a deep pit. "Who do you think you are standing here preaching, 'Here I am the law'? You're just someone lucky to even be at this gate, standing outside the fence." Those words cut deeper into the air already tinged with blood. A child walking past with his mother overheard them, his eyes wide as he clung to her skirt, gaze blank and stunned. The mother pulled him away faster, not daring to look back. The others stayed frozen in place, sensing this was no longer just a clash, but an unmasking of ugly raw power so naked it repulsed. The woman didn't step back. Her lips curled, not in a smile, but like she was holding back a storm buried deep beneath the surface. Her voice rose again, each word landing like a hammer striking stone. "You can flash that badge. You can shout others into silence, but justice has never bowed to power built on humiliation. And I'm not standing outside this gate waiting for your permission." The words struck the crowd, directly drawing a few gasps. Some people shifting awkwardly, as if they'd just seen fire ignite in hands they thought were empty. The steps beneath them quivered as someone in the crowd stomped hard, the sound of shoes slapping stone making a few flinch. The air was so thick that even breath felt loud. The officer's fists tightened, breath-heavy eyes blinking fast as if scrambling to find words to crush the resistance he'd just heard. But the quiet defiance in her stare left him speechless, and all he could do was let out a short, bitter laugh before grinding his teeth and stepping closer so near he only had to lift a hand to touch her shoulder. The crowd tensed, sensing the moment of combustion had come, and no one dared breathe too hard, afraid the spark would erupt into a blaze they couldn't contain. In that moment, the lines were clear. On one side stood a man, claiming law as a whip to strike the people down on the other, a calm but unshakable woman refusing to bow to blatant disgrace. The courthouse, once meant to command reverence, had turned into a silent battleground where eyes and words became blades drawn against each other. And every witness there knew they were watching the start of a great storm, one that wouldn't just sweep across these cold stone steps, but spread beyond to the towering walls of power once thought untouchable. The courthouse hallway felt like a giant stone box, its pale yellow light from worn-out overhead fixtures casting blotchy patches of shadow and glow, making each footstep echo like a hammer hit in a hollow space. This place had been designed to suppress noise, to force everyone entering it into silence, as if to remind them that the law could only exist in solemnity. But today's silence wasn't solemn. It was stifling thick, like air compressed between four cold walls. The black woman walked forward with steady breath, each step soft yet reverberating, dragging behind it endless echoes. She had passed through the heavy wooden door, leaving behind a courtyard still ringing with mockery and contempt, hoping the hallway might offer a pocket of quiet to breathe in. But the darkness hadn't yet cleared when another shadow spilled forward, blocking the path. The officer appeared like a living wall, his broad shoulders taking up nearly the hallway's full width, arms hanging loose but tense knuckles pale from clenching. His heavy leather shoes struck the gray tiles with a dull thud that made the cramped space feel even more suffocating. He didn't step fully forward, but the way he stood blocking the way, exhaling the harsh stink of stale smoke, made the already cold air grow even more acrid. His eyes darkened, and his voice came out from deep in his throat, rough but clear, each word slicing through the silence. "You're just a cheap PR prop." The words echoed down the hallway, bouncing off the cold walls like shards of insult hurled and flung back louder. It wasn't just mockery, it was a sentence he passed down, reducing her to a tool, something polished up for show but never truly valued. His stare sharpened with scorn, lips curling into a cruel smirk, shoulders subtly shifting as if feeding on the satisfaction of watching someone else get debased. He took one small step forward, his shadow falling across her, pressing as if to force her back. But the woman didn't move, her eyes locked on his, unwavering and unmoved. That calmness was like a flawless mirror, reflecting every ounce of his aggression, and it only fueled his frustration. The yellow light caught in her gaze, burning like a quiet flame in the night, and that glow alone made him realize the words he'd just thrown didn't bring her down. Instead, they exposed him. Footsteps echoed from the end of the hallway, hurried urgent like the beat of a racing heart. A young clerk, thin and clutching a thick stack of files, was rushing forward as if trying to make it in time for a hearing. As he drew closer, he stopped short, eyes widening his face, paling at the scene before him. He looked from the officer's scowling, aggressive expression to the woman standing tall, and for a brief moment there was something in his gaze that seemed to want to speak. But then came a sharp blade-like glance from the officer, slicing straight into him, and whatever flicker of courage had appeared in the young man's eyes vanished. He lowered his head, bit his lip, and quickly slipped past shoulders brushing the wall, footsteps tapping fast and fading away around the corner. The hallway fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't solemn. It was complicit. The clerk's retreat confirmed what everyone already knew. No one wanted to be involved, no one dared speak up, and no one was willing to break the twisted order playing out before them. That silence was heavy as chains binding the space, isolating the woman entirely. She watched the young man's figure disappear, a trace of sadness in her eyes, but it quickly returned to that straight, unwavering gaze. She turned back to face the man blocking her, her voice clear and steady, not loud but strong enough to echo through the corridor. "What are you so afraid of that you have to block the way?" The question cut through like a sharpened blade. It wasn't looking for an answer. It was exposing the cowardice hiding beneath that uniform of authority. Her eyes locked on his, icy and direct, and for a moment the officer flinched, his broad shoulders seeming to sag. But he quickly stiffened again, letting out a crooked, hollow laugh that scraped the air like rusted metal. "Afraid I'm not afraid of anything. I just think it's funny that someone like you believes she can walk alongside us." He stomped hard on the floor, the heavy sound vibrating, breathing through the tiles, making the ceiling light tremble with a faint rattle. That aggression landed like a final stamp on the image of warped power, fed by the silence of bystanders and the contempt of those wearing the badge. The woman still didn't move, her eyes fixed, her posture firm. Her breath remained steady, but the hands hidden in her sleeves had tightened fingernails pressing into her skin as if holding back a surge. She knew that right now every passing second mattered, every watching eye was recording the truth, and it was her unwavering silence in this pressurized space that struck the hardest blow against the man standing there in brute defiance. The air in the hallway thickened so heavy one could hear the faint hiss of the overhead lights and feel the weight of the officer's breath as he leaned in closer, as if trying to swallow his opponent whole. But her gaze, clear as glass, blocked everything, reflecting back his distorted image. In that stifling silence, it became clearer than ever that this confrontation wasn't just between two people, but between calm determination and the aggression of power under threat. And as everyone else turned away, their silence wasn't innocent. It became the soil where violence took root, magnifying the suffocation and driving the tension even higher. The witness waiting room sat deep in the western hallway, a square space with 4 white-painted walls now stained yellow with age. Pale yellow light from a single round bulb hanging overhead spilled onto the gray tile floor, creating an in-between kind of space just bright enough to see everything, but still leaving shadows lurking in the corners. On a wooden bench against the wall, the female judge sat quietly, both hands resting on her lap. A small table in front of her held several open case files, papers, catching the light in patchy reflections. She lowered her gaze to her right hand, her index finger gently tracing her wrist, where a thin but deep scar remained a line not large, but raised and stubborn like a cut that never agreed to heal, and with one touch the memory of those unjust days in handcuffs came flooding back, a wound that kept knocking on her mind. Wind slipped through the hallway and under the wooden door, bringing a chill with it, but not enough to drown out the familiar hoarse voice. That officer's voice rang out again, no need to see him to know he was right outside the door, his mocking laugh scraping into the room like nails dragging across metal. "All you people do is cry once you're caught." The venom in his words spilled into a space already thick with silence, making the room seem to tremble. A few staff members inside flinched, one pretending to arrange papers just to avoid eye contact, another frowning slightly, but choosing to stay quiet. His insults weren't directed at anyone by name, but everyone knew exactly who they were meant for the woman sitting there. The judge lifted her head, the dim yellow light casting over her calm face. Her gaze didn't waver, but her hand on her lap tightened slightly, fingertips pressing against the scar on her wrist. That scar had once been etched by cold handcuffs during an unjust arrest, the result of a random check back when she was younger, still believing silence could shield her from being noticed. What she got instead were looks of disdain, shouted words that dug into her skin with their focus on her color and her gender. The scar wasn't just from metal, it came from a system too used to clamping down on those who dared to stand tall. Outside in the hallway, footsteps echoed uneven, neither fast nor slow, as if the person out there was deliberately stretching out his presence to intimidate. The sound of shoes striking the tile floor seeped through the thick wooden door, joined by a faint laugh that drilled into the four walls like a slow bore. But perhaps he didn't realize his actions were being watched. In the technical room, one floor above, a surveillance staffer was checking the monitoring system. On the screen appeared the image of the officer standing close to the witness room door, his lips moving with words laced with prejudice. The audio wasn't on, but the motion of his mouth was unmistakable, each word visible like invisible subtitles. The technician froze, heart pounding, and instinctively hit the record button as if something deep inside warned him this was evidence that needed to be saved. Inside the waiting room, the female judge still sat upright, saying nothing, but her hand clenched so tightly the veins stood out sharply. She drew in a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them, a glint of cold steel flashing across her gaze. Her voice rang out, not aimed at anyone in particular, but clear enough to pierce the air, reaching past the door and striking the heavy silence surrounding them. "This scar is proof you can't erase." The words stopped everyone in the waiting room. A young staffer set his files down abruptly, eyes wide, as if hearing that kind of certainty for the very first time. The room tensed like a tightened string because everyone understood the statement wasn't just directed at the man outside, it was a declaration for everyone present, a reminder that truth sometimes lives in wounds faint but screaming through the silence. The pale yellow light fell across the wooden table, catching its old stains and stretching the judge's shadow across the tile floor. That shadow stood solid, unmoving like a dark pillar, holding its ground in a suspended space. Outside, the officer must have heard because his footsteps hit harder, his breathing louder until both faded away as he walked off. But his presence hadn't ended, it still lingered in the air like a threat waiting to snap, as if he had only stepped back to prepare for something more violent. The woman looked down again, her finger brushing the scar, the sting of it shooting straight to her heart. She closed her eyes, and the memory rushed back of being dragged away in a crowded market under the indifferent eyes of so many. The sound of the cuffs snapping shut rang out once, but that sound had echoed hundreds of times in her mind. And today, in this witness waiting room, she knew what she was facing came from the same root as that day. Only now, she was no longer the young woman with a bowed head, but the one who would walk out and place justice on the scale. A cold gust of wind blew in from the window, lifting a sheet of paper from the stack on the table and sending it drifting to the floor. She bent to pick it up, her eyes landing on the words morning hearing. Witness must be present on time. The line read like a reminder that her presence today wasn't just to listen or observe, but to prove something through her presence, through the wounds she carried, through the scar that had become undeniable testimony. Sitting upright, she released her hand, letting the pale yellow light fall on the scar one last time. Glimmered not with the shine of metal, but with the light of a truth that had existed too long to be denied. And in that moment, all the mockery, the insults from the hallway and the tormenting memories of the past, gathered into a surge of strength rising in her chest, and she knew that when that door opened, there would be no more silence, only the next confrontation, and this time the scar on her wrist would be the flame lighting every step forward. The heavy wooden door opened, revealing the vast space of the main courtroom. The ceiling stretched high with faded yellow chandeliers hanging quietly, their light spilling down in long streaks across rows of polished wooden benches. The air felt compressed, so dense that even whispers echoed too loudly. Every seat was filled, from lawyers and court staff to a few curious civilians, all silent now, with only the scratch of pens and the soft rustle of paper breaking the stillness. At the witness stand, the officer wore the practiced mask of a seasoned veteran, sitting upright, hands clasped together as if he were the embodiment of composure. He began to speak in a voice smooth and sweet, each word flowing as though rehearsed for a lifetime, just polished enough to conceal the venom folded into every corner of his speech. In all my years of service, he said slowly, his tone laced with fatigue but tinged with pride, I've worked with all kinds of people, every color, every class. I've never seen skin color as an issue. But it's unfortunate that some people choose to turn their race into a weapon, a shield, to attack the police, to deny the truth that we're out here protecting the law with our blood and sweat. The words fell into the air like oil on fire. A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd, some nodding, slightly others frowning in discomfort. Those who had witnessed his insults at the gate and in the hallway now heard his words with even greater bitterness. In the back row, the female judge sat still, hands pressed firmly on her lap. The light cast down on her face, deepening the shadow in her eyes, each word he spoke jabbing like a needle into a memory still bleeding. Her heart pounded, breath held tight, and her silence simmered like a flame ready to rise. He kept going, eyes scanning the crowd for validation. Some people don't know humility. They think a past title or reputation gives them the right to stand equal to the law. But this law doesn't bow to anyone, and it won't be twisted by those who try to use race to smear people like us. His sentence stopped on people like us, stressed, separated, drawing a clear line between them and us. Those trained to bow would understand the message instantly, and that division made the discrimination even more exposed. The female judge rose slowly, the wooden chair scraping a dry, sharp sound across the room. Dozens of eyes turned to her at once, half in surprise, half in expectation. The ceiling light swept across her face, highlighting the calm but unshakable resolve within it. Her voice rang out, strong and steady, not rushed, but with every word hidden like an arrow piercing the disguise of the man seated at the witness stand. Justice doesn't wear a police hat. Justice protects, it does not humiliate. The echo of her words rippled through the room, making even those who had been taking notes lift their heads. A few in the crowd instinctively clenched their fists, some let out a breath as if they had just heard what they themselves hadn't dared to say. The officer froze for a moment, then his face flushed red, blood rising in his eyes. He slammed his hand on the table and shot to his feet, the wooden chair behind him toppling backward and hitting the stone floor with a chilling crack. "You dare!" he roared, his voice cracking apart no longer, holding the calm facade from earlier. His boots struck hard as he stormed forward, the pounding of his footsteps crashing through the courtroom like a small storm. The crowd recoiled, some stepping back, entirely forming a ring of space around the center. He charged ahead, arm raised high, face blazing, red eyes wild, like someone who had lost all reason. In that instant, the room seemed frozen, the breath of dozens of people caught in their throats. The female judge did not step back. Her eyes remained calm, but the light in them was sharp as a blade. As his arm came close, her body turned slightly, one foot anchored firmly on the stone floor. Her shoulder dropped low, then surged upward, her arm folding into a clean, straight line. The punch came fast and clean without warning, like a bolt of lightning crashing down straight into his cheekbone. The impact echoed loudly, a dry crack of bone and flesh colliding, sending a jolt through the entire courtroom. The officer staggered, stepping back, one hand flying up to his face, eyes wide in disbelief. The crowd exploded in gasps and shouts, mingled with sharp intakes of breath, as if they had just witnessed the impossible. He dropped to one knee, breathing hard, his eyes bloodshot, not from pain, but from shock, because he couldn't believe that here in the very place he had called his house, he had been knocked down by the same woman he once humiliated. The presiding judge slammed the gavel down hard, the wooden strikes ringing out one after another. Order, order in the courtroom. But the sound of the gavel couldn't drown the resonance of that punch. It had etched itself into the memory of everyone present. The female judge stood upright, arm lowered, breathing steady, her cold gaze locked on the man kneeling before her. No more words were needed. Her presence alone now made it clear to the entire room that steadfast silence had become power when it mattered most. No one in that courtroom would ever forget the moment that punch was not just self-defense. It was a symbol of everything, long suppressed, breaking loose of justice, once obstructed, now striking back to survive. The scrape of chairs, the rush of shoes on tile, voices rising through stunned silence, all of it merged into one sound, the collapse of false authority. And from that moment on, no one in that room could ever look at that officer the same way again. The parking lot behind the courthouse, usually quiet with rows of neatly parked cars, was now in chaos with phones ringing non-stop. In a shadowed corner beside a concrete pillar, a group of law students who had just left the courtroom huddled together, faces flushed with excitement. One of them, a boy with messy hair and glasses, fumbled as he unlocked his phone, pulling up a short video just captured during the moment the courtroom had erupted in shouts after the punch. The sound of yelling and the gavel pounding for order blurred into chaotic background noise, but the footage was shockingly clear, the officer lunging forward, hand raised, then the clean pivot. The judge's fist landing squarely on his cheek. The frame shook, and in the next instant the smug expression on his face twisted in shock. The student inhaled sharply, eyes blazing, and quickly tapped the upload button. Social media opened, and seconds later, the clip went live with a bold caption across the center, "Black Judge." It wasn't fabrication, it was a public declaration calling out the identity the officer had tried to trample, now turned into a banner leading the charge. As the post went up, the first few seconds passed in silence. Then the phone buzzed violently as notifications poured in. One share, then 10, then hundreds, alert tones overlapping screens lighting up like sparks bursting from the small confined parking lot. The space, once filled only by the sound of wind weaving through the parked cars, now rang with the constant chiming of alerts, each phone in hand, becoming a torch passing on the flame. The student laughed nervously, his friends clutching their heads, one even breaking into tears from sheer adrenaline, all of them realizing that this moment was no longer trapped within the courtroom's four walls. It would spread beyond the courthouse, past the city, crashing into the face of a system that thought it could bury anything. Social media exploded in minutes. Across platforms, the short video popped up repeatedly, each post accompanied by comments packed with rage, awe, and solidarity. One person wrote, "This wasn't just a punch, it was truth breaking loose." Another added, "Black judge justice finally has a face we can believe in." The number of shares skyrocketed by the second, each tap on the share button like a blow against the silence the officer had tried to construct. Hashtags began to surface, at first scattered, then building into a tidal wave, and the phrase, #justice for her, appeared in all caps, bolded, showing up on thousands of posts within the hour. At the cafe across from the courthouse, people sipping their morning coffee were startled when the TV screen on the wall switched to a replay of the video. Faces froze, some lowered their cups, some leaned back in their chairs, unable to believe they had just seen such a scene unfold in a place long considered sacred. An elderly man exclaimed, "I've never seen anything like this in a courtroom." Then came a soft clap from one table, followed by another spreading table to table, not loud but clear, like a shared heartbeat beginning to form. On further street corners, people scrolling through their phones lit up when they saw the image of the judge standing firm, her fist lowered. Some stopped in the middle of intersections, heads crowded around screens arguing loudly. Some were thrilled, some furious, but no one remained indifferent. Other officers who saw the clip either frowned or quietly swiped past it, but they all knew the situation had spiraled far beyond control. In a student dorm across the city, a packed room huddled around a laptop erupted in cheers when the words "Black Judge" flashed across the screen. A female student shouted, "She's a real judge, and they blocked her right at the gate." Her voice cracked from emotion, but her eyes burned like fire. In another apartment, a black family sat together in front of the TV. The father clenching his fists, the mother holding back tears, and the child asking mom, did she win? The question hung in the air, but the answer was already in the parents' eyes, win or lose. She had just taught the world a lesson about standing up. Back in the parking lot, the group of students still stood, huddled, their phones buzzing nonstop. The boy with glasses nearly burst into tears when he saw the alert. Your video has reached 10,000 shares. In just minutes, the number climbed 50,000, then 100,000. The comments flashed by too fast to read, but every line carried the same message: truth can't be blocked, justice now has a face, and no badge or authority can silence it. This scene was like a fire catching from a single spark. The punch in the courtroom was that spark, and the viral video was the wind that turned it into a storm. Now, that storm had blown far beyond the courthouse, flooding streets, homes, and glowing screens held in millions of hands. No one could stop its momentum anymore because it was no longer just a clip. It had become living proof, a symbol, a belief. Within a few hours, #justice. For her wasn't just trending in the city, it had spread to other cities and even crossed borders. Online news outlets began publishing stories using the exact phrase "Black Judge" in their headlines. Reporters crowded in for quotes, TV stations scrambled to change their programming. Everywhere, from noisy bars to quiet libraries, people whispered about the punch, about the look in her eyes, about the woman who dared to rise in the very place where she was expected to bow. And each whisper, each tap on a screen, became another brick fueling the rising wave, ready to crash through walls of injustice that had stood far too long. The morning cafe, usually filled with the hum of conversation, the steady hiss of the espresso machine, and the clinking of spoons against glass cups, had turned thick with tension. Every sound seemed to funnel toward the television mounted high on the wall where the screen played a continuous loop of breaking news. The footage slowed down, then replayed again and again, showing the moment the officer charged forward, hand raised, followed by the clean pivot and the unexpected punch from the female judge. The frame jolted the stunned expression on the officer's face, freezing into the memory of every viewer, and the bold red words "Black Judge" appeared beneath the scene. The cafe fell silent for several seconds. No one even breathed, and then it erupted in chatter. A middle-aged man in the corner sneered, his voice long and slow, half mocking, half dismissive. "Just wait. They'll turn her into a hero. All that over one punch." His words drifted through the space just loud enough for a few nearby to catch. A young woman at the next table slammed her coffee cup down, liquid sloshing over the rim. Her eyes lit with fury as she snapped, "Were you there? Did you see how far she was pushed? If she hadn't been cornered, would she have had to throw that punch?" Her voice rang out sharp and unfiltered, drawing heads from every direction. The tension thickened, glares, nods of agreement, scoffs, all blended to turn the cafe into an impromptu courtroom where everyone crowned themselves judge of the moment that had just exploded into public view. In a shadowed corner near the window, an elderly woman with silver hair and a small thin frame sat quietly, a cloth bag resting on the chair beside her. Her eyes stayed locked on the screen, unblinking, as if trying to engrave every detail. When the punch replayed once more in slow motion, she suddenly spoke, her voice hoarse but steady, trembling yet firm. "That's a sight you don't forget for the rest of your life." Her words turned a few heads, softening their expressions, because in her tone there was no excitement, no sarcasm, only the recognition of someone who had lived long enough to witness injustice, and now saw justice taking shape in a form she could finally believe in. Her hands trembled, the glass in her grip slightly shaken, but her eyes sparkled, holding back tears that almost fell. Meanwhile, outside the cafe, passers-by stopped in their tracks as they caught sight through the window of the crowd inside, all eyes fixed on the screen. Phones lit up in every hand. The video had spread too fast to contain. From social media, it spilled over into mainstream broadcasts, playing on repeat. Special bulletins interrupted regular programming, leading with the image of the punch and the headline flashing in red, "Black Judge." The event was no longer confined to a courtroom, no longer contained within the boundaries of a trial. It had burst out and overrun everything else. Across the city, at an emergency press conference, a representative from a human rights organization stood before a cluster of microphones. The woman, dressed in a dark suit, eyes steady with resolve, spoke each word with clarity. "No one stands outside justice. When a black judge is blocked and humiliated right at the courthouse door, it's not just a personal insult, it's a deep crack in the system. And when she stands up, she does not stand for herself alone. She stands for everyone who has ever been pushed out of justice's reach." The statement was immediately clipped, circulated online, replayed on television, and became fuel to the firestorm spreading through public opinion. In small apartments, the sound of the television mixed with conversations. A young couple eating breakfast stared at the screen, the husband setting his chopsticks down with a tight voice. She did what so many wish they could, but never dare. The wife, eyes wet, replied softly, "At least our daughter will see someone stand up." In a university library, students crowded around a laptop, the video looping on screen as fists hit tables. Voices rose, debates ignited. Nearby, some furrowed brows in disapproval. A judge hitting someone in court. What kind of justice allows that? The objection rang out, only to be drowned by rebuttals. That's not violence, it's resistance. The argument dragged on, but the divide itself made the topic impossible to ignore, stripping away the last of the indifference. The wave of outrage didn't stay behind closed doors, it spilled into every street. In the morning market, amid calls of vendors, a few old phones played the video. Rough hands pointing at the screen, mouths gasping, curses and sighs overlapping. On crowded buses, passengers passed phones hand to hand, some young men cheering, some elders frowning, but no one looked away. Down a narrow alley, children ran in circles shouting, "Black Judge," their voices ringing against stained brick walls. Adults watched, some smiling, some sighing, but no one stopped them because even the children had become part of the swelling public storm. As night fell, every evening, news broadcast led with the image of the courtroom shaken under the punch. News channels aired it on repeat, analyzing every angle, every expression. The officer's face at the moment of impact was zoomed in, his look of shock etched into the viewers' minds. Experts debated from opposite ends, some calling it justified self-defense, others warning that violence in court was a dangerous precedent. But praise or criticism alike only amplified the moment, turning it into a story hotter than anything the media had carried in recent memory. From cafes to markets, from alleyways to living room TVs, the outrage had broken past the screen. It crept into everyday conversations, into meals, into glances exchanged on the street. People argued, people took sides, people even interrupted normal talk to discuss the punch, the judge, the officer who had humiliated her. And that quiet infiltration was the most powerful part, because justice, once only an abstract concept, now had an image, a sound, a fist as evidence. From this point on, no street corner was quiet enough to stand outside the storm, and once the storm had risen, it wouldn't stop until it found its final answer. That morning, the district police office felt as if it were wrapped in a thick gray fog, not the kind that drifted in from outside, but one made of tension scowling faces. Newspapers scattered across desks and computer screens glowing with sensational headlines. News of the courtroom punch had spread everywhere, and now the focus had shifted away from the judge's action to the man who had dropped to his knees in humiliation. His identity was exposed overnight, no barrier could contain it. His name, age, rank, and even old photos of him on patrol were dug up, analyzed, and critiqued. The press missed nothing, running bold headlines like "Officer who screamed at judge, 'This law was written by us,' and the man who claimed to defend justice but blocked it at the courthouse door." Phones rang non-stop at the front desk, reporters packed outside the gates, cameras aimed at every window waiting for a glimpse of someone inside. News outlets dug into his past, flipping through every file, and soon the dirt started to surface. It was discovered he had been involved in a series of random street stops, disproportionately targeting black individuals, pulling them over, searching them, mocking them on the sidewalk. A young woman went online to accuse him of tearing her bag open in the middle of a market, sneering as she held back tears. Another man recalled being forced to lie face down on the pavement just for asking why he was stopped. These stories, once buried in internal files, now poured out like an unstoppable flood. Inside the police building, the usual chatter was gone, replaced by tense glances and quiet shuffling. In a closed meeting room, his superiors called an emergency meeting. Blue uniforms lined both sides of the long table, case files in hand. The commanding officer slammed the table, his voice low. "We need to stop this flow of information. No more leaks from inside." Another officer spoke up, face tight with concern. "The media is coming straight for us. If we don't get ahead of this, the department's reputation is finished." But no matter how tightly they tried to seal it, the information kept leaking, each fragment like a crack in an old wall. One internal staffer, perhaps out of conscience, released an old disciplinary report detailing years of complaints and controversial conduct that had long been shelved. Within hours, that document landed in reporters' hands and made the evening news. The banner, scrolling across the bottom of the screen, sent chills through viewers. Man who once claimed to uphold the law, now accused of repeated misconduct and racial bias. In the office, whispers rose. Some colleagues shook their heads. Others stayed completely silent, avoiding each other's eyes. No one dared speak openly, but the truth was plain. The wall protecting him had cracked, and the storm outside was sweeping everything away. The harsh glare of the neon lights made the tension even sharper, casting a stark glow over pale, drawn faces. The officer sat in the corner, both hands gripping his head, his face frozen. He said nothing. Eyes, bloodshot, locked in a struggle with his own fury, but there was nowhere left for it to go. Any excuse now was meaningless with images and evidence already flooding the outside world. The public was outraged, and posts demanding a full investigation spread rapidly. Live streams drew thousands of viewers all shouting together in the comments, "The one who disgraced justice must pay." That phrase spread like wildfire, repeated in print online and on signs held up by small groups outside the police headquarters. No one called him by rank anymore. No one remembered his name. Instead, he was branded with a label, "The one who disgraced justice." Those 3 words became a public sentence etched into his image, making every attempt to shield him look even more absurd. On street corners and in tiny restaurants, the story kept coming up as the main topic. People dug into his past, comparing it to the moment of disgrace in the courtroom, ending their conversations with the same sigh. If there hadn't been a video, all of it would have been buried. The consensus grew fast, turning into spontaneous gatherings and chants demanding transparency. International media joined in reporting this as clear proof of rot within parts of law enforcement. And once the public had hold of it, no closed-door meeting could bury it again. No locked door strong enough to muffle the pounding demand from outside. In a room filled with scattered files, the officer sat motionless, eyes fixed on the tile floor light from the frosted window, casting a pale gray over his figure. Every ring of the phone struck like a nail into the coffin of his career. Every headline on TV hammered it deeper. He had lost everything, from the authority he held in the department to the fear he once inspired. Now, all that remained were looks of contempt and the new name the world had given him, the one who disgraced justice. The meeting room was tucked deep in the ground floor of the police headquarters, its 4 walls coated in white paint, now stained yellow, windowless, bathed in the cold glow of neon lights. A large round table filled the center, surrounded by weary faces. Some gripped their coffee cups without drinking, others sat with arms crossed, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, monitoring public reaction. The air was thick, the silence stretched, broken only by the soft tapping of a pen on the table. And when the commanding officer finally spoke, the real storm began. A senior officer with a hoarse voice and heavy shoulders slammed his hand on the table, voice echoing, "We cannot protect wrongdoing." Everyone saw the video. Everyone heard the insults. "If we keep covering this up, the whole system will be buried." His words dropped like a stone. Some nodded, eyes flashing with agreement, but were quickly drowned out by a growl from across the table. A younger officer, jaw tight, punctuated each word. "Don't sell out a fellow officer. He might have been wrong, but he's one of us. If we divide, they'll tear this whole force apart." Back and forth it went, the round table turning into an invisible battleground. One pointed to the stack of complaints piling up, and another shouted in anger that it was all a smear campaign. Folders were slammed onto the table, papers flying, chairs screeching across the floor. A salt-and-pepper-haired officer sighed, speaking slowly but firmly. "I've worn this uniform for over 30 years, and I've never seen public trust sink this low. If we keep shielding this, we'll lose everything." Across from him, another pounded the table. "You think the public will turn on us over one punch? They'll forget, as long as we stand together." The arguments piled up, voices bouncing off the walls, intensifying the tension. In a corner of the room, a few young officers sat quietly, eyes down on their files, their minds not just wrestling with a colleague's actions, but with fear for what lay ahead. They once believed the badge stood for justice, but now saw it used as a shield for misconduct. One slowly looked up, voice soft but clear. "A uniform doesn't cleanse guilt. If we don't take action, everyone out there will think we're complicit." The words fell like a blade slicing through the silence that followed. But the hush shattered just as quickly when another officer stood abruptly pointing. "You're still green. You don't understand how ruthless it is out there. If we let the media win, no one will believe in us again." The round table suddenly became a fault line, splitting into two clear sides, one demanding transparency, the other fiercely defending secrecy. Voices overlapped, some lowered to a murmur, others shouted as if trying to drown out everything else. The superior, at the head of the table, sat with hands clasped, face darkened, saying nothing. But it was his silence that made the arguments even more brutal. Suspicion crept in, and the looks exchanged across the table no longer belonged to teammates, but to rivals. The wave of public outrage outside hadn't even flooded in yet, but inside the room, the fracture had already begun to show. Everyone knew that once the crack ran deep enough, this concrete block of power would no longer hold. The news from the closed-door meeting didn't stay contained for long. No leaks were necessary. Fragments of the dialogue slipped out like irreparable cracks. Journalists quickly caught wind, and online outlets published detailed breakdowns of the police department's internal clash. Readers saw quotes like, "We cannot protect wrongdoing," and read the sharp rebuttals, "Don't sell out a fellow officer." Bold headlines followed, "Police force divided over courtroom punch behind closed doors, public trust cracks wide open." The articles came with illustrations showing a round table split in two with officers on opposing sides, and that image flooded social media within hours. The public followed closely. Conversations at street stalls, on buses, around dinner tables all revolved around one question: are they defending justice or just defending each other? No one debated the punch anymore. The image of division within the ranks had become the true trigger for unease. What was once seen as unity, the strength of the system, was now exposed as a chorus of conflicting shouts, turning trust into shards. A street vendor pouring tea whispered, "If they don't trust each other, how are we supposed to trust that bad?" A passing remark, yet quickly repeated, echoing through alleyways, becoming a folk verdict on the collapse of faith. On television, political analysts spoke with grave tones. One said, "The danger isn't the punch itself, it's the fact that it exposed the cracks within the system. Once as people realize that they'll see it's no longer a united front." Across from him, a sociologist added, "We're witnessing the unraveling of public trust, something built over generations now shaken by internal division." These words were clipped, shared, replayed. Audiences listened and nodded because they no longer felt like distant warnings. They were reality unfolding right before their eyes. In small town squares, groups of people gathered in clusters holding up morning newspapers, still fresh with ink, pointing directly at the headlines and shaking their heads in dismay. An older man, his voice hoarse, said to his friend, "They used to at least keep up appearances. Now they don't even bother." His friend let out a dry laugh. "Wouldn't matter if they tried. When something's rotten, it'll show sooner or later." That exchange mirrored thousands of similar conversations happening everywhere, and gradually public opinion reached the same conclusion: this system no longer stood on solid ground. The fracture spread quickly, not just because the media reported it, but because people were hungry for a glimpse of the truth. They had grown too used to stiff declarations, and now seeing the police ranks openly divided, they knew the mask of unity had fallen. Fragile trust collapsed instantly. They no longer viewed the force as a solid block, but as a patchwork unraveling piece by piece. In the comment sections online, someone wrote, "We don't need enemies outside, they're tearing each other apart." The words were cold, but they garnered thousands of approvals. From coffee shops to working-class neighborhoods, from TV screens to printed pages, the image of that crack kept growing, overshadowing every attempt at justification. People saw that the system was no longer unified, and once that truth was exposed, there was no putting it back together. The conversation was no longer about one individual, they saw an entire structure shaking. The storm of outrage was no longer scattered at waves, but a surging current sweeping away what was once thought untouchable. And, in the eyes of millions from this moment on, power no longer resembled strength. It was just the image of a widening crack across a wall far too worn. The central square, usually crowded only during festivals, had become a surging sea of people. Flags and banners filled the sky, their bright colors unified by one rhythm: justice for all. The chant thundered, echoing off surrounding buildings, rolling down alleyways, spreading like a massive wave. People held up posters of the punch messages scrawled in red paint, slogans that were sharp and defiant. In the heart of the crowd, hands raised high, faces burning with intensity, rage, and hope coexisted, transforming the square into one massive body, with every shout pulsing like blood through its veins. The procession stretched endlessly, pouring in from all streets into the center. The young marched beside the old women, locked arms with strong men. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, all united in one unwavering chant. Flags printed with the word justice flapped in the windcloth, fluttering like flames. The sound of drums, horns, and plastic bottles striking pavement formed a pounding rhythm that made the crowd move like a rushing river, sweeping away anything in its path. People passed around bottles of water, shared torn pieces of bread, and exchanged glances filled with understanding, as if they'd become a new community born in that very moment, one that stood with justice. On a nearby rooftop, reporters crowded together, cameras flowing nonstop lenses sweeping across faces and banners. Major news networks had set up live broadcasts beaming the overflowing square to the entire country. Every chant that rose sent tremors through the control rooms, forcing anchors to pause before they could continue speaking. The whole nation seemed to converge on this place. Even from thousands of miles away, millions could hear justice for all and feel themselves joining in. At the peak of this fervor, when the crowd was holding banners high, a familiar figure suddenly emerged from behind the makeshift stage of steel frames. At first, people didn't realize who it was, but when the figure stepped up the stairs and approached the microphone, the square erupted. The female judge, walking calmly with unwavering eyes, stood tall on the raised platform. No one had announced her appearance, and that very surprise made the thousands fall silent, replacing their chants with a deep, resounding hush, as if they wanted to hear every breath from the woman standing before them. Morning light spilled down a shaft of sun, landing on her shoulder, etching the image into the collective memory. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the calm but radiant eyes, no longer marked by the humiliation at the gate or the tension in the courtroom, but filled with a boundless strength. The square erupted again in cheers, voices shouting her name, a roar that shook the ground. She did not raise a hand, did not shout, simply stood tall, letting her presence be the answer. That very image became the message. Justice was not a promise. Justice was standing in the square, facing thousands, and justice belonged to all. No one needed a long speech. Her presence alone ignited the fire, made those holding signs grip tighter, made the chant, "Justice for all," ring louder. They felt that this fight was no longer on a screen or in a news report. It had stepped into reality, onto the high platform of the square, beating with every heartbeat in the crowd. And from that moment on, the wave of justice could no longer be restrained, spilling into the streets, carved into the memory of a day when a nation cried out a single message: justice must belong to everyone. The female judge stood firm on the platform, the wind sweeping through the square, making the banners tremble like the pounding hearts of the thousands below. She looked out at the surging sea of people, every eye fixed on her, waiting, yearning for a word of affirmation. When the microphone crackled slightly, she did not rush to speak, letting the silence stretch for a few more seconds, letting that stillness tighten around every heart, turning anticipation into an unbearable longing. Then her voice rang out calm but resolute. "Justice is not anyone's privilege." The short sentence cracked like thunder, echoed through loudspeakers, bounced off glass walls, reverberated back, shaking the square. In that instant, Tens of thousands fell silent, then exploded. The answering chant roared across the space, justice for all. It repeated, surging like waves crashing against stone one after another without pause. The square trembled, flags rose high as if to tear the sky, fists pounded in rhythm, and the ground shuddered beneath synchronized footsteps. People shouted and cried, tears mixed with laughter, in a swell of emotions beyond words. Cameras captured thousands of faces, from vibrant youth to silver-haired elders, all sending their answer skyward. Justice was no longer an empty slogan. It was a belief shared, shouted, and affirmed by a community. That sound didn't stop at the square. It spread through every street, poured into every alley, and through live broadcasts it went far beyond the city limits. Viewers in distant rural towns heard the chant, their hearts pounding in sync, eyes welling up as they realized they were breathing with the crowd in the grand plaza. A group of young people jumped onto a car roof shouting, passing around a scrawled banner, their eyes blazing. A mother holding her child cried as she raised her hand high, her trembling lips repeating each word, "Justice is not a privilege." That moment surpassed the bounds of a typical protest. It became a celebration of will, a collective oath. The loudspeakers could no longer contain the chant because it was now the people's hearts acting as the loudest amplifiers. The square no longer held distinctions between leaders and followers. Everyone blended into one voice, one message. And on the stage, the female judge quietly looked down, her eyes shining, letting the chant carry her, witnessing the truth. Justice had left the hands of any one person. It had become the shared strength of thousands of millions. The answering chant shook the square, shook the city, and in that moment, even the walls that once shielded injustice seemed to tremble, signaling an inevitable collapse. People no longer felt alone. They saw each other, heard each other, and believed that once they raised their voices together, no power could silence them. And from the ground of the square, an invisible vow was carved deep: justice will belong to all, and no force will be strong enough to take it away. That morning, the prosecutor's office felt more like a trench overflowing with paperwork. Stacks of files towered on desks, pale yellow covers labeled densely with tabs, video evidence, witness testimony, incident reports. Folders were passed around, clipped and marked with a red pen. Each page, a piece of the larger picture, gradually coming into view. Young prosecutors hunched over computers, rewinding courtroom footage, examining each frame, taking notes on the officer's words caught by courtroom microphones. Every sharp tone, every condescending glance became undeniable evidence. Witness statements were strung together. Someone described the hallway where the judge was blocked. Someone else recalled slurs spoken in the crowd. These were no longer scattered anecdotes, but a thick, unified case file weighing down the wooden desk before the lead prosecutor. On the other side, the officer at the center of the public firestorm was finally facing formal interrogation. The investigation room was sealed white fluorescent lights, casting harsh shadows on the cold metal table. He sat upright, his face stiff, hands clasped but subtly trembling as if straining to appear composed while barely holding back his anxiety. When the prosecutor questioned him, his voice came back curt. "I was doing my job, nothing more." When pressed about the video, he clenched his jaw, voice dropping. "She provoked me first. I reacted to uphold the law." The line sounded rehearsed, dry, and repetitive, but that very repetition exposed the hollowness of his defense. The prosecutors exchanged glances. Someone shook their head, because what he said didn't align at all with the evidence. The deeper the questioning went, the more aggressive his tone became. At times, he slammed his hand on the table, eyes flaring as if trying to intimidate those interrogating him. He insisted again and again that he was the victim, that the accusations were part of a smear campaign to ruin his name. But on the screen, the video played slowly, clearly, showing his face, leaning and speaking insults. Those words caught by the mic had echoed through the courtroom and now echoed again in the interrogation room. There was no need for interpretation. Everything was visible, undeniable. The more he defended himself, the wider the gap grew between his reasoning and the truth, turning his claim of self-defense into incriminating evidence. Meanwhile, the young prosecutors diligently noted each word, flagging every inconsistency, preparing for the final report. They weren't just collecting facts, they were reconstructing a pattern of behavior, a system of abuse, wearing a badge that tried to crush justice. Each one of his excuses only tightened the legal noose, drawing the circle closer. The atmosphere in the room was so thick that even the sound of pens scratching paper heightened the tension. Outside, public outrage continued to surge, but inside the prosecutor's office, a quieter version of justice was being woven together with documents, videos, and layers of testimony. And, as each file was closed, each signature placed on the final page, it became clear to everyone that this investigation would not stop at one individual. It was beginning to shine a light on an entire system, with cracks growing wider by the day. As the interrogation reached its critical point, the officer lifted his head, eyes bloodshot from stress, his voice firm as if trying to shut down all further questions. "I was attacked first." He spoke the words sharply, emphasizing each one like hammer blows, casting a challenging look around the room as if to project control. But the room fell silent. No one wrote anything down. The prosecutors only exchanged glances, a silent consensus forming that this moment had just exposed everything. Across from him, the lead prosecutor opened the thick case file again, eyes settling on a bold red note. Witnesses confirmed it was the officer who charged at the judge first, and the video clearly showed that movement from the furious glare to the clenched fist. The statement, "I was attacked first," now stood out as a jarring, misplaced fragment in a picture already complete. The young prosecutor beside him slowly raised her head, red pen poised over a transcript, its tip pressed tightly against a marked section. She didn't need a signal from her superior. Every contradiction was now glaring. In the footage, they had all seen him leap up and lunge like someone out of control, and now he was spinning a story that reversed everything. The room grew heavier, the silence thick enough that even the ticking of the wall clock seemed loud, but that silence offered him no protection. It felt more like the pause in a courtroom when everyone, jury and prosecutor alike, realizes the accused has just contradicted himself beyond repair. The lead prosecutor quietly closed the folder, tapping one finger against the cold steel tabletop, his gaze razor sharp. "You're saying you were attacked first?" he asked, voice low and deliberate, but weighted enough to press down hard on the man across from him. The officer swallowed, then nodded firmly as if committing to a path he already knew led off a cliff. That false confidence shattered the moment the prosecutor held up a still frame from the video showing the officer's wide-eyed face, arm raised, charging toward the bench. "When was this taken? Would you like to explain it further?" The question hung in the air, but no one needed to hear the answer because the truth was already undeniable. Another prosecutor opened the witness statement file and slowly read the words aloud. He was the one who charged first. The female judge stood still. The voice echoed like a hammer striking the table, cutting off any possible escape. The officer squinted, forehead damp with sweat, lips pressed tight, but unable to produce another word. The contradiction was undeniable, and he had created it himself through a clumsy lie in a moment of panic. No one in the room needed to say anything more, because everyone understood that the final report would include one crucial line: testimony contradicts the evidence. And that one short, devastating sentence would be enough to pull the entire legal system into action, ending any attempt he had left to justify himself. Outside, the public had not yet learned these details, but inside that small room, the scales of justice had clearly tipped. The lead prosecutor sat upright, his eyes cold as steel, closing the case file with a loud clack, like the shape of a verdict taking form. The officer breathed heavily, shoulders weighed down, but there was no way back. From the moment he said the words, "I was attacked." First, the truth had turned against him, and the prosecutors recognized that contradiction as the final blow, slicing through every false layer he had tried to wrap around himself. The hearing room gleamed under white lights, each ceiling lamp seemingly set to double brightness, exposing every corner, leaving no room for ambiguity or evasion. The witness chairs were lined in order, and those summoned sat anxiously awaiting their turn, with the rustle of papers, the rapid tapping of pens, and the occasional cough breaking the tense silence. When called, the young clerk stepped up to the stand, worry written on his face, but his gaze steady. He adjusted the microphone, his voice trembling at first, but gaining strength as he spoke. He blocked her path right in front of me. I was just a few steps away, saw it clearly. The room fell silent after his words, the bluntness striking through the defensive wall the officer had tried to build. The rows of prosecutors exchanged looks, knowing this was the crucial piece that fit into the whole picture, confirming that the female judge had indeed been blocked not just by allegation, but now backed by direct witness testimony. The presiding officer nodded, made notes, and signaled for the next witness. A technician came forward, carrying documents and a laptop. He opened the device, and the large screen behind him lit up, displaying footage from the internal camera. The video slowed, zooming in on the officer's face as he leaned in, lips moving. The technician enlarged the frame and played the audio, and the room echoed with a condescending voice, chilling in its clarity. "You people only know how to cry when you get caught." A heavy silence blanketed the space, then whispers erupted, heads shook, and angry eyes locked on the man sitting in the witness box. The technician continued. "I reviewed the footage, frame by frame. There's no sign of tampering or distortion. This is the original file from the storage system, irrefutable." That statement rang out like a bell, silencing any further attempts to justify or deflect. The officer in the corner, flushed red hands tightly, clasped jaw clenched so hard the muscles stood out. He tried to maintain composure, but his eyes darted around, avoiding the screen, now playing evidence that couldn't be twisted. A defense lawyer rose to object, but was immediately cut off by a prosecutor. "Do you have any evidence that this audio was manipulated?" The question rang out unanswered. The technician remained standing, voice firm, gaze unwavering, as if he knew that in this moment his duty wasn't just a technical report, but to uphold the truth. Inside the hearing room, everyone present could feel the shift in atmosphere. At first, there were skeptical glances, hushed whispers exchanged, but as each testimony and piece of evidence was laid bare, the truth began to take unmistakable shape. The young clerk, through courage, had opened the chain of cross-examinations, and the technician, through precision, had nailed down the case. Together, they rendered the officer's earlier defense hollow, the contradictions laid plain, in the glaring light of the hearing room where no detail could be concealed. The truth steadily backed the man in the hot seat into a corner, transforming him from an authority figure into the subject of the room's collective gaze, judged both by reason and by eyes. And from that moment on, everyone understood the wheels of justice could no longer be reversed. A few of the officer's colleagues were called to testify. They stepped forward slowly, their faces visibly uneasy. When questioned, they hesitated and deflected their words, hesitant, as if walking a tightrope between two abysses. One pursed his lips and said softly, "I'm not sure. Maybe it all happened too fast. Maybe he was just trying to keep order." Another cleared his throat, eyes lowered to the table, and added, "I've worked with him, never saw any clear signs of prejudice." These testimonies lacked conviction, not strong enough to mount a defense, but revealing a faint attempt to preserve a trace of their colleague's image, or more accurately, to shield themselves from the storm of public backlash tearing through the system. Yet, the moment they finished, the prosecutor immediately played excerpts from the video matching each sentence to prior evidence. The judge's voice as she was blocked, the hostile face of the aggressor, the contempt-laden shout, all slowed down and echoed through the bright courtroom. The feeble defenses offered by his colleagues were like tissue-thin veils torn easily by a single pointed question. The audience shook their heads, sensing the contradiction, seeing the reluctance in the eyes of the officers called as witnesses. Rather than defend, they exposed a fracture, a system not yet ready to face the truth head-on. Tension mounted with each passing minute. The creak of chairs, the wave of whispers rising and then fading into silence as the presiding officer raised a hand. The conflict in the testimonies made the cramped room feel even smaller, the air thick and stifling. The young clerk sat again in the back, hands clasped, eyes downcast, but inside stirred a blend of anger and sadness. He understood that the truth was already clear, yet some still chose to twist around it just to avoid admitting fault. The technician sat motionless too, his expression hardened, as if what he had just heard only reinforced his resolve to protect the data to the very end. On the witness stand, the officer sat motionless, but his eyes flashed with satisfaction at the vague defenses being offered. He clung to any gap, hoping to turn these off-key statements into a lifeline. But the contradictions were too glaring, and the prosecutors only needed to repeat a few cross-examination lines to underscore them. Each page was turned, marked with thick red notes like arrows aimed directly at the man struggling to stay afloat. The courtroom was so heavy with tension that even a breath sounded loud. Spectators sat upright, eyes locked on the stand, feeling each impact of the conflicting testimonies. They were no longer passive onlookers. They had become silent jurors within themselves, quietly weighing, quietly judging. And when the presiding officer closed the day's hearing, everyone knew the tension had not eased. It had only risen higher than ever. The opposing testimonies hadn't softened the accusations, but instead made the flame of justice burn fiercer, because truth, when trampled too many times, rises back like a storm no force can hold back. The hearing, now open to the press, turned the already tense room into a crush of cameras and flashes, with the clicking sounds echoing non-stop. Reporters' faces were focused, pens poised over notepads, all eyes fixed on the large screen in front. When the prosecutor gave the signal, the video played, slowed down, and the officer's lips were clearly visible. Sound was unnecessary, each mouthed word easily read. Black judge emerging across sharp frames. The courtroom erupted, gasps and shouts spilling into the back rows. Some leapt to their feet, pointing at him. Those words became living proof, undeniable beyond excuse or denial. The officer froze, then flushed red, his furious eyes bulging. He screamed, slamming the table, his chair skidding back, his voice tearing through the room. "It's all lies. They edited it. That I never said it." His voice cracked, breaking into harsh grating sounds, and the more he shouted, the more he revealed himself as someone unraveling. Reporters swiveled cameras his way, capturing every detail, twisted lips strained, neck veins, trembling hands clenched in rage. His outburst didn't blur the evidence, it shattered the last layer of composure, revealing the face of a man too used to unchecked power, now cornered. Tension surged, journalists scribbling frantically, some whispering over phones as breaking headlines were prepared on the spot. Observers whispered, then rose into a wave of outrage. Someone exclaimed, "We just saw him trample the truth again." Another shook their head, eyes burning with contempt, because the footage was crystal clear, every word unmistakable, and still he thrashed like a drowning man grasping at air. The prosecutor didn't speak. The chaos spoke for itself, and his unraveling made one thing obvious: the mask had shattered completely. In that moment, the press's presence turned the room into a public stage where nothing could be hidden. Cameras swept the space, capturing everything from his fury to the stunned faces around him, broadcasting it live beyond the courtroom walls. The crowd, watching on hallway screens, roared in outrage, their cheers mixed with curses, as if justice itself were being decided right there by the audience. And from that point on, everyone understood the truth had stepped fully into the light. There was no escape from the shadow he had cast. His face turned purplish, veins bulging at the temples, sweat soaking his forehead, yet his eyes still burned with fury. He slammed his hand on the table, his voice hoarse, words bursting out in a furious, incoherent stream. Every movement only made the courtroom see more clearly his loss of control, a man once in power, now revealed as a raging beast backed into a corner. Cameras zoomed in, snapping rapidly, capturing a moment no excuse could erase. The audience, already outraged, now felt only revulsion, with scattered jeers rising from the back rows, every sound striking his crumbling pride like a blade. The presiding judge struck the gavel sharply, the sound echoing through the courtroom, demanding order. But, as the final echo faded, the disciplinary council swiftly delivered its decision. The announcement rang out, each word etched into the air. Immediate suspension from duty, pending the outcome of investigation and prosecution under the law. The statement, brief but crushing, struck the ears of the flailing man with the weight of 1,000 pounds. He froze his trembling hand, gripping the edge of the table, eyes wide as if unable to grasp how the power he had relied on for years had collapsed in an instant. The room erupted in noise, reporters writing furiously, breaking news typed out on the spot. Spectators whispered, some clapped, others simply nodded. But in every glance was the same realization: the downfall had come at the right time. Cameras panned across the scene, capturing a once arrogant officer, now pale and silent, frozen like a statue, a vivid image of the price paid for abuse of power. Outside voices from those watching on screens echoed, groups chattering loudly as if the entire city shared a single judgment. The moment the council delivered its decision marked more than the end of a single man. It sealed a message about a system that once shielded him, but now was forced to bow under the weight of evidence and public pressure. Every spotlight beam, every flipped page of notes, contributed to portraying the instant the mask fully fell, leaving behind the bare truth of a man stripped of authority. The thick tension that had hung in the room seemed to lift, as if that very decision had opened a door, letting justice step through after being held outside for far too long. And when the hearing temporarily adjourned, no doubt remained. From the moment the disciplinary council issued the suspension, the path ahead was clear: not cover-up, not compromise, but a direct march toward justice. People left the courtroom with the sense they had witnessed a turning point, where one who once stood arrogantly had fallen to the bottom, and amid the noisy departure, the echo of the judge's gavel still rang out like a reminder that the law belongs to no one. It bows only to the truth. The courtroom was packed, TV station lights sweeping across the space, making it glow like a stage where truth had no place left to hide. Every seat in the audience had its eyes fixed on the witness stand, where those who had once stayed silent now stood up together. They didn't need to coordinate, because what they witnessed had become a shared memory that couldn't be erased. The young clerk spoke first, his voice shaky, but every word clear. He blocked her right in front of me. I saw it with my own eyes. Immediately, a technician stepped forward, replaying the video preserved in the system, matching the earlier testimony. Then came other witnesses from bystanders to young colleagues in the courtroom, all confirming the same truth: obstruction, insults, and finally violence by the officer. That unity formed a wave sweeping away any lingering doubt, making the whole room hold its breath with each statement. The prosecutor rose, placed his hand on the table, his eyes steady as they swept across the courtroom before locking onto the jury. His voice rang, even and firm, not raised but strong enough to strike every heart. We are facing a textbook case of abuse and discrimination. A police officer, instead of defending justice, turned his power into a weapon to humiliate and oppress. This wasn't a momentary lapse, but a symptom of a disease deeply rooted, and if we don't stop it, it will continue to spread injustice. He paused, pulled from the file a set of enlarged video stills, raising them for all to see. The image of lips forming the words "Black Judge" blown up, the contempt in his eyes, frozen on paper, became undeniable evidence. The accusation was more than just a legal procedure. It was a resounding bell of justice, reminding society that what happened couldn't be brushed aside. The courtroom shook, and spectators leaned forward, their eyes blazing with anger and anticipation. TV cameras captured every nod of the witnesses, every echo of the prosecutor's words broadcast in live to millions of screens. Out there in coffee shops, offices, schools, hospitals, wherever there was a TV or a phone screen, people sat silently watching, letting the voice of justice enter the corners of everyday life. Meanwhile, the officer sat with his head down, his face rigid, hands trembling as they tapped unconsciously on the table. The accusations hit like arrows piercing through the last layer of his defense, leaving the power that once protected him as nothing more than a crumbling wall. He no longer shouted, no longer objected, knowing that the more he spoke, the tighter the truth would close in. His silence now wasn't a strategy to protect himself, but an admission of helplessness in the face of the rising tide of evidence. And when the prosecutor finished speaking, the room erupted in murmurs, the air thick as if about to explode. A spectator stood up and began clapping, then others followed until the sound became a wave of applause echoing off all four walls. The live broadcast captured that moment, turning it into an image that spread everywhere. A courtroom not just trying an individual, but letting justice speak in its loudest voice, affirming that truth will always find its way into the light, no matter how many layers of power try to block it. The jury's private deliberations ended faster than expected. They returned with solemn faces, eyes in agreement, each step carrying the weight of a collective decision. When the jury spokesperson stood up, the courtroom fell completely silent, not a cough, not a whisper. Only the waiting for each word to land. His voice was clear, firm. We unanimously charged the officer with abuse of power and discriminatory conduct. The statement hit like a hammer, simple yet decisive, ending all attempts at excuse, silencing every clumsy defense that had dragged on for days. That moment seemed to shake the very walls, and the spectators, long holding back their emotions, could no longer stay still. Applause burst from one corner and quickly swept across the room, crashing like ocean waves. No longer just individual cheers, it became a chorus of release, of renewed belief. Hands clapped together in thunderous rhythm, shouts of joy broke out, transforming the once tense courtroom into a celebration of justice. Journalists snapped photo after photo, capturing radiant smiles and tears falling in the rush of release. In the middle rows, some spectators gripped each other's hands. Some stood with heads held high as if witnessing the start of a new chapter. All eyes turned to the judge, who had remained composed until the final moment, now nodding, slightly lips pressed tight, but eyes glowing. Outside the courtroom doors, the roar of the waiting crowd echoed in, blending with the applause inside into a chorus proclaiming that the truth had prevailed. The officer sat motionless, his face collapsed, shoulders heavy as if the space around him had crumbled. Every eye turned toward him, no longer with deference, no longer with fear, only contempt mixed with a sense of justice served. The moment the jury reached its unanimous verdict crushed the last illusion he had clung to. The applause now was no different from a public sentence, louder than any words that could be written on paper. The live broadcast brought the full scene outside, allowing the entire society to witness the moment justice was reaffirmed. In cafes, homes, offices, and classrooms, viewers were glued to their screens, falling silent for a second before breaking into applause as if they too were present in that very room. That collective force transcended the walls, turning into a wave that spread everywhere, a reminder that once the truth is protected, no power can hide it forever. As the applause gradually faded, the courtroom still echoed with its resonance, not just in sound but in swelling emotion. It was a rebirth of belief, the belief that the law is not just words on paper, but something that can rise up and defend those who have been trampled. And in that moment, everyone understood they had witnessed something unforgettable, a turning point that history would remember, where justice spoke out and was met with thunderous applause from an entire community. On the morning of the sentencing, the sky hung heavy with gray clouds, and a light drizzle tapped slowly against the old courthouse roof, signaling a weighty day ahead. The hallway leading into the courtroom was packed, from reporters to activists to ordinary citizens, all wanting to witness this historic moment firsthand. When the presiding judge entered the room, fell completely silent, and the gavel struck clearly, a reminder that the final truth was about to be delivered. The defendant, the former officer, sat hollow-eyed, gaunt, his shoulders slumped, so unlike the arrogant figure who had once stirred public outrage. The judge's voice rang out, each word distinct. The court orders the dismissal of the defendant and prosecution on charges of abuse of power and systemic discrimination causing serious harm to public trust. The sentence struck the room like thunder in the rain. No one spoke at first, waiting to see the reaction of the man who once wore the badge of the law. But he only lowered his head, fists clenched, sweat mingling with rainwater on his hair, dripping in slow rivulets onto the cold floor. The entire room witnessed that silence, the bowed head of someone long used to commanding others, now unable to meet anyone's gaze. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every drawn line on his stunned face, turning his downfall into an image that spread everywhere, letting the public see the price of misused power. The atmosphere in the courtroom felt frozen, the silence stretching for several moments before breaking under the sounds of pens, signing chairs, shifting, and quiet whispers among those in attendance. Some nodded, others wiped away tears, and some held each other's hands as if sharing in a collective victory. Outside, the drizzle kept falling, as if washing away the long-settled grime from justice's robes. Reporters immediately pushed out breaking news alerts, headlines flashing across phone screens. Officer guilty of abuse, officially dismissed and prosecuted. Each word lit a fire in those who had known injustice, restoring their belief that justice might be delayed but never absent. In a corner of the room, the female judge sat quietly, her deep gaze reflecting the long road just traveled. She didn't smile nor show satisfaction, but held a calm expression like someone long familiar with life's harsh blows. Yet her eyes held a steady strength of proof of the faith she never lost, not even when blocked, insulted, or denied. Her presence in this moment was the clearest answer justice had finally been restored, and truth had made its way through the mud to find a place of clarity. The courtroom fell silent once more before the presiding judge struck the gavel to declare the session adjourned. One by one, people stood and left their seats as the rain outside began to pour harder. Up front, the officer was escorted out under tight security, his face still lowered to the ground, avoiding every camera, every gaze. That image closed a dark chapter and simultaneously sounded a warning bell that no matter how firm power may seem, it can collapse when faced with the truth. And in the echo of the rain, in the footsteps ringing across the wet stone floor, people understood that this sentence was not just for one individual, but for all the shadows that had loomed over justice for so many years. At first, in the moment, just after the sentence was read, the courtroom remained heavy with silence, as if everyone needed a few seconds to absorb the full weight of the decision. Then, from the back rows, a slow round of applause began, not loud, not chaotic, but like a quiet rhythm affirming collective agreement. Others joined in, hands coming together, not to celebrate one man's downfall, but because they had just witnessed justice being served in its truest form. The sound echoed quiet but resolute, bringing a sense of solemnity like a farewell to the old remnants of injustice being ushered out. The applause didn't last long. It faded to make way for silence again, and in that silence, each person carried a renewed belief in fairness. The female judge sat in the front row, quietly watching, her face betraying no clear emotion. When the final gavel struck, she stood, gathered a few sheets of paper, and walked slowly through the crowded rows. Outside the glass doors, the drizzle continued, silver-gray light casting her shadow long across the cold tile floor. People watched, but no one called out because her stride said everything. With her back straight and steps steady, never looking back, she moved like a stone statue, emerging from the storm cold, but unshaken, untouched by whispers or curious stares. That image was etched into the memory of everyone present, a silent symbol of resilience and unbreakable dignity. Amid the crowd, gradually leaving the courtroom, her footsteps formed a path of their own, separate from the noise behind her. A few reporters raised their cameras, then lowered them again, sensing that this moment was not meant to be captured but preserved. She walked not with the pride of a victor, but with the calm of someone who had just witnessed the truth come to light after years of suppression. Each step against the stone floor blended with the rain outside, a quiet but steady rhythm, evoking a sense of continuation, that this journey was not ending but had only just begun a new chapter. In the eyes of the public, that image became a message more powerful than any speech. A woman had stood up, faced humiliation and oppression, then risen above it all to prove that the law does not bow to abusive power. Now, as she quietly walked away, they understood that no loud declarations were needed. Her steady stride alone affirmed that justice is not a fleeting flame, but a slow, enduring light, strong enough to illuminate even the darkest shadows. And in the stillness, the applause from earlier seemed to echo faintly, somewhere blending with the rain, becoming the background music to an immortal moment. The law lecture hall that day was packed to the point that even the last seats were taken, with many students standing against the walls to listen. The atmosphere didn't feel like a typical class, but more like a major discussion session where everyone was eager to voice their thoughts. On the board, a video clip from the trial was being replayed, showing the moment the officer lost control and the sentencing was delivered clearly. The professor tapped the chalk lightly on the desk and affirmed, "This is a textbook example of the complex relationship between power and justice, a lesson you must carry with you for life." The hall buzzed with whispers, some students scribbling notes quickly, others sitting up straight as if suddenly awakened to something profound. Hands were raised, students taking turns to share their thoughts. A young man said that power in the hands of the police is supposed to protect citizens, but when it becomes a weapon, society pays with a loss of trust. A girl in the front row countered, saying justice doesn't naturally come from the system, but requires the courage of individuals to speak up, just like the female judge did in the face of public pressure. Another group of students debated passionately about the responsibility of the law, not just to deliver a verdict, but to spark real change that prevents similar events from happening again. The opinions clashed, lively and intense, but necessary, turning the lecture hall into an arena of intellect where the truth was dissected to its core. In the back row, an immigrant student stood up, his voice calm but firm. He said this story reminded him of the scrutiny he faced just because of his skin color, but the image of the female judge walking out of that courtroom gave him hope that justice could belong to everyone. The class fell silent for a few seconds, then applause broke out, not loud but full of meaning. The professor nodded, eyes gleaming with pride, knowing that the most valuable lessons don't come from textbooks, but from real life, from upheavals that force society to reflect on itself. As the discussion drew to a close, the professor emphasized once again that the case wasn't just a dark chapter of abuse of power, but a spark for reform. He urged his students to remember that the law only holds real value when it's used to protect human dignity, not shield those in power. The bright eyes across the room that day showed that seeds of belief had been planted, and one day they would be the ones standing at the front lines defending justice against new challenges. And as chairs scraped and students filed out, the air still hummed as if the great lesson they had just experienced was still alive in every young heart. As the students' lively discussion gradually faded, the entire lecture hall fell silent the moment the female judge stepped up to the podium. Light from the window spilled down, casting a glow over her upright figure, giving her words a weight far beyond any theoretical lecture before. She looked around, slowly scanning the youthful faces watching her, then spoke with calm yet resonant clarity. "The law is not a stick for anyone to swing at will." The sentence was simple but precise like a blade, cutting through the thick atmosphere of debate. It wasn't just a reminder. It was a warning compelling everyone present to ask themselves what they would do to keep the scales of justice from becoming weapons in the hands of the powerful. In that moment, the students seemed spellbound, eyes, wide open pens, frozen mid-page breaths held still. A few nodded, as if finally finding the answer to long unresolved question. Some pressed their lips tight, eyes glassy, touched by the words that stirred personal memories of witnessing injustice. No further explanation was needed. That one sentence alone was enough to serve as a compass for an entire generation preparing to step into the realm of law. Then, without cue, applause began from the middle rows, hesitant at first, but quickly swelling into a wave crashing against the four walls of the lecture hall. This applause was unlike the routine clapping at the end of the class. It was fierce, urgent, filled with respect, admiration, and the joy of witnessing a truth revealed. The sound surged into every heart, shaking the room as if the hall had transformed from a classroom into the birthplace of a movement. Some students jumped to their feet, clapping relentlessly, pulling others into the moment until the entire hall beat with a single rhythm. In that energy, the lines between professor, judge, and student blurred, everyone united in their shared belief in justice. The female judge remained where she stood, quietly watching the response spread through the room, a gentle smile on her lips, her eyes reflecting faith that the words she sowed today would bloom in time. She didn't need to say anything more. The applause itself was the most powerful answer to her message. As the sound slowly faded, another silence fell, not of tension, but of solemnity, as if everyone had made a silent vow together. And from that moment on, the lecture hall held not just a lesson in legal theory, but an enduring reminder that justice must always be upheld with a fair hand, never wielded as a tool of fear. Across cities, large and small streets once filled with the noise of traffic and the rush of daily life, now lit up with banners held high, bold slogans hastily scrawled on cloth, yet carrying the sincerity and anger of tens of thousands. From the capital's central square to remote towns, the atmosphere surged with energy as a new wave had begun to spread, the domino effect from the trial and its seismic verdict. Victims who had long stayed silent, who once bowed their heads under insults or violence, were now standing up. No longer whispering their stories in kitchens or dim alleyways, they now stood in public, microphone in hand, pointing into cameras, recounting what had been done to them. Each story was a piece of a larger puzzle, and as the pieces came together, society was shaken by the full picture of a system that had allowed injustice to grow unchecked. A middle-aged woman, voice trembling, lifted her sleeve to reveal an old bruise still not fully faded, her words choking as she recalled being handcuffed without cause in front of her young son. A young man stood on the stone steps of City Hall, his face marked by years of wrongful imprisonment, speaking with a rasping voice. "I was accused of stealing because of my skin color." These stories were filmed, live-streamed, and within hours became the focal point of every social media platform, jolting the public awake to the severity of the issue. What once seemed like isolated accounts now merged into a chorus of accusation, forcing truth into the open and creating pressure no one could ignore. That momentum quickly turned into collective action. Human rights organizations, already watching closely immediately, began drafting class action lawsuits against local police departments. Files were meticulously assembled, evidence, audio recordings, photographs, all stacked together to form a weight heavy enough to shake an entire system. In courts across the country, lawyers and community representatives appeared side by side, demanding sweeping investigations into abuses of power and systemic discrimination. Each new lawsuit was not just a continuation of the last, but another tile in the domino effect, pushing the justice wheel farther and faster. That same energy rippled through the youth students, school children, who had once only observed from afar, now joined in turning school campuses into hubs of discussion, flyer printing stations, and platforms for peaceful marches. They were no longer haunted by the fear of being just one small voice, because reality had shown them that one voice could join thousands more, and when amplified could become a roar nothing could silence. Across city streets, images of the female judge walking resolutely on the day of the verdict were printed on posters hung on walls and even painted in graffiti on old buildings, becoming a symbol reminding everyone that anyone can rise up to break the silence. In that context, international media quickly joined in, reporting on the wave of class action lawsuits and calling it a rare turning point in the nation's legal history. Local authorities were thrown into confusion. Some attempted to cover things up. Others chose silence, but public pressure kept building. The domino effect no longer stopped at recounting and accusing. It had sparked a chain reaction. New incidents surfaced. Fresh investigations began, and doors once tightly shut were now forced to open. And in every chant on the street, every word on a banner, people saw that this was no longer a personal case. It was a wake-up call for a society hungry for real justice. From the first class action cases, the shockwaves spread faster than expected. Prosecutors' offices across multiple states were forced to launch a series of new investigations, not just into specific individuals, but into entire systems long protected by layers of excuses. Old files were reopened, shelved cases brought back to light, and every accusation was now being documented and reviewed more seriously than ever. Many police officers who thought they had escaped consequences years ago now had to face revived evidence and live-in witnesses. Independent commissions were also formed, made up of lawyers, activists, professors, and community representatives to monitor the investigations and ensure nothing would be buried again. Media outlets provided non-stop updates reporting each newly exposed incident. In a small southern city, an old video surfaced showing a group of officers violently beating a detainee, now becoming evidence that placed the entire department under scrutiny. In another city, a group of black women filed a collective complaint over unjustified searches, drawing immediate public attention. With each passing day, more cases were opened like small flames catching across a dry, cracked forest. From north to southeast to west, no place could consider itself safe from the rising tide of truth. People followed every detail, not missing a single update. They discussed it in cafes, markets, and subway rides, all sharing one conclusion: justice was truly returning. The silence that had blanketed society for so long was broken, replaced by candid conversations about racism, about power in the hands of police, and about the responsibility each person bears when faced with injustice. The expansion of new investigations had moved beyond legal procedures, turning into a full-fledged social movement that swept across every layer of society. At universities, students held conferences discussing legal reform. Human rights organizations built stronger alliances to provide legal support for victims, and artists wove the story into their work, from rap music and paintings to documentaries. Each field acted as a spark, and together they formed a blazing wildfire. The outrage was no longer a fleeting emotion. It had transformed into collective strength, into concrete action, and into a determined push for lasting change. The fire of justice kept spreading, growing from small flames into a massive blaze, burning away the thick layers of silence and cover-ups. People saw in each other's eyes a renewed faith, the belief that the law was not a game for the powerful, but could truly be a shield for everyone. Marches followed one after another, slogans lit up the night, blending with songs, drum beats, and the joyful tears of those who once believed their cries for help would never be heard. And at the center of it all, the figure of the female judge still loomed, a silent yet powerful symbol, a reminder that justice might be delayed, but when it ignites, no force can stand in its way. In the grand hall of an international conference on justice, bright lights illuminated rows packed with scholars, leaders, lawyers, and human rights activists from across continents. On the main screen, footage from the courtroom back home was played again, the police officer screaming uncontrollably, followed by the sentencing amid applause. The moderator introduced the case as a textbook example, a vivid illustration of the consequences of abuse of power and the urgent need for reform. The hall fell silent for a few seconds. Then whispers filled the space, not from surprise, but from the recognition that this issue was not confined to one nation. It reflected a condition present in many parts of the world. As the discussion segment began, representatives from various countries took turns speaking, many openly condemning racism and the abuse of authority by law enforcement. A minister from Africa emphasized that what happened in the recent trial mirrored stories his people had endured for decades. A scholar from South America shared that in his homeland, racial discrimination had long smoldered like a small flame, and if not addressed in time, it would erupt into a wildfire. A female parliamentarian from Europe declared that the case served not just as a wake-up call for one country, but as a global reminder that justice must always be accompanied by equality. Without it, the law is just an empty shell. Delegations did not hesitate to propose solutions, from tightening oversight of police conduct, improving training programs, to establishing international cooperation mechanisms for investigating human rights violations. Several countries pledged to promote a joint resolution to make discrimination and abuse of power a central focus of upcoming United Nations sessions. Condemnations were written into a joint statement read aloud in the hall and received near unanimous agreement. Under the flash of international media cameras, those declarations spread across news agencies, becoming headlines in global newspapers. The atmosphere of the conference went beyond statements of condemnation. Many human rights activists shared similar incidents from their own countries, forming a chain of connected stories like threads pulling distant lands closer together. Each story, no matter its continent, shared the same core: human beings devalued for their skin color, power, used to oppress instead of protect. As these stories unfolded, many in the room shed tears, not out of sorrow, but because they felt part of a shared struggle that transcended borders and nationalities. The event concluded with a clear affirmation that the case of the female judge was not just a domestic lesson, but a global reminder. Her image appeared on the screen, walking steadily through the light rain after the sentencing day chosen as the symbol of the conference. The entire room rose in applause, not to honor an individual, but to affirm the belief that justice knows no borders. And in that moment, the applause echoed beyond the hall, carried with a message sent across the world: if one spark can ignite from a single trial, then thousands of others can light up the world. As the conference moved into its final segment, all eyes turned to the female judge as she was invited to the stage. The bright lights illuminated her composed face, where no trace of personal pride could be seen, only the resolve of someone who carried immense responsibility. She began in a calm, steady voice that carried through the hall, not loud, but each word cutting through the air. Justice has no borders. The room instantly fell, still rows of chairs frozen, as if holding their breath to listen. That statement was no longer a declaration of one nation. It was a global affirmation, like a flag planted for all to rally around. Following her opening, she continued by saying that if justice is confined by territorial lines, it ceases to be justice, because everyone in the world has the right to live under the protection of the law and human dignity. She spoke of her journey not to boast of victory, but to illustrate that change always begins with a single action. one. A single voice then grows into thousands more. "What matters is not what I have done," she emphasized, "but whether we all of us have the courage to uphold what's right when faced with abusive power." Her words struck a chord, prompting some delegates to nod continuously, others to wipe away tears as they saw the reflection of their own nation's struggle in her story. The international press did not miss a beat. As soon as she finished speaking, keyboards clicked rapidly, flashes went off in quick succession. Within hours, major newspapers from New York, Paris to Tokyo featured her words. "Justice has no borders" on their front pages. International commentators praised her as a symbol of unwavering resolve, proof that personal courage can awaken collective strength. In-depth television segments declared that this trial and her speech would be cited in future law textbooks as undeniable evidence of justice's power to transcend national boundaries. On social media, clips of the speech spread at lightning speed, subtitled in multiple languages. People from across continents left comments sharing empathy and hope that the spark from what once seemed like an isolated incident had now become a light, guiding a collective path forward. A veteran journalist wrote that he had attended hundreds of conferences but had never seen a room so full fall into such unified silence just to hear each word. And when the applause erupted after the final sentence, he knew he had just witnessed a moment that would go down in history. In that atmosphere, the female judge never claimed to be a hero. She simply smiled and bowed, leaving behind an image both humble and unforgettable for the thousands in attendance. That phrase, from the moment it was spoken, no longer belonged to her alone. It had become a slogan for a world longing for change. And as articles, documentaries, and commentary programs praised her in waves, everyone understood that the weight of justice, once spoken at the right moment, could no longer be contained by any border. In a small room on a quiet street corner, the sunset streamed through the window, casting a soft orange glow over the pale walls as the female judge sat silently beside an old wooden desk. In front of her lay the notebook she had carried for years, its pages yellowed, the edges worn from countless times being opened to record both pain and hope. She gently turned each page, then paused at an entry written years ago, where shaky handwriting captured the days of humiliation, the times she was wrongfully handcuffed, and the loneliness of witnessing justice being trampled. Her hand unconsciously touched her left wrist, where an old scar still remained, a mark once etched in pain, now bearing a new meaning. If it once recalled bitterness, now it stood as proof of endurance, a testament that she had not fallen beneath the weight of injustice. In the quiet room, memories rushed back vividly, each old scene playing like a slow-motion reel. The image of police blocking her path, the snarled insults, the contemptuous stares from the crowd, all reappeared as if it were yesterday. But this time, in remembering, she no longer saw herself as small or helpless, because after everything she knew, she had won not a victory in a personal fight, but a triumph in transforming wounds into strength that could move society forward. She exhaled a long breath that carried relief, as if finally releasing a burden she had carried for years. Outside the window, the sun dipped behind rooftops, leaving the sky streaked with red, like the emotions still quietly burning inside her. On the desk, a pen sat ready, inviting her to write a new line in the notebook already filled with so much sorrow. But this time she didn't write in anguish, she wrote with conviction. She recorded that the scar was not merely a personal mark, but a legacy of a generation, a reminder to those who followed that they must never bow to injustice. The pages, once soaked in tears, were now continued with words soaked in hope. In that moment, the female judge realized that her true legacy wasn't in her position or the rulings she had delivered, but in her ability to pass on a spirit of defiance to others. Because justice, no matter how it is defined in textbooks, only survives when carried forward by courage and resolve. She smiled softly and closed the notebook, letting the last rays of sunlight rest on its cover, as if the sun, too, wished to witness the passing of a legacy into the future. In that small small room, there was no applause from a crowd, no flash of cameras, but there was a quiet victory, one more enduring than any verdict. And from that point on, her legacy was no longer just a personal story, but a torch lighting the way for those who would continue the journey. A soft knock sounded just as dusk began to fall, and the female judge looked up to see a group of young people standing shyly on the porch. Their faces held a mix of eagerness and hesitation, their eyes glowing with trust and the curiosity of youth seeking direction. When the door opened, they stepped inside cautiously, bringing with them the fresh energy of a new generation so different from the heavy stillness that usually lingered in the small room. One representative spoke up, his voice still uncertain but filled with determination. "We want to hear from you. How do we stay strong when facing injustice?" The question was simple, yet it carried the longing of an entire generation hoping to follow in the footsteps of those who came before. The female judge quietly observed them, faces still unmarked by hardship, but eyes burning with intensity. She saw herself in them, as she had been many years ago, walking forward with the same mindset, uncertain and searching for guidance in the dark. That moment warmed her heart, not with pride, but with a deep reassurance that the seeds of justice had begun to sprout within these young people. She nodded, gently invited them to sit around the old wooden table, and opened the notebook that had become a living memory of her own journey. The faded words emerged like witnesses to a long road, and she let them see with their own eyes rather than only hear it told. "What I went through isn't to frighten you," she said, her voice slow but resonant, "but to help you understand that justice always comes at a cost. There were days I paid in tears, nights I nearly lost all hope. But if I had given up, there would have been no one left to stand." The group listened closely, each word slowly sinking into their minds. A young woman clenched her fist, her eyes welling up but shining with belief. A young man nodded as if finally finding the answer to doubts he'd carried for a long time. Then she raised her hand and lightly touched the scar on her left wrist this time, not with pain but with pride. "This scar was once a source of shame, but now it's proof that I survived and didn't let justice die. You too, when you face your wounds, remember they're evidence that you dared to walk forward." Her words rose like a small flame lighting up the room bathed in sunset. The atmosphere shifted, no longer heavy with memories, but warm with the passing of a torch, a sense of continuity. As the group of young people stood to leave, they no longer carried the timid air they had when first stepping inside. On each face glowed a renewed sense of belief, their shoulders straighter, their steps more assured. The female judge watched them go, a faint smile on her lips. She understood that she had just passed on the story like a torch, and that torch would be shared, multiplied to light the roads ahead. In that moment, her legacy no longer belonged to a small room, no longer rested in the pages of an old notebook, but had become a living force within those young individuals. And as the streetlights outside began to cast their glow, she knew with certainty that the darkness would never swallow the light that had just been passed on. The wide square was bathed in morning light, flags fluttering across the sky, and thousands of banners raised high with the words "Justice for All" standing out as a shared declaration. The sound of the crowd echoed throughout the space chants in unison, blending with drums and music, creating an atmosphere both powerful and peaceful. In the middle of that sea of people, the female judge stepped onto a makeshift wooden platform standing tall, her eyes sweeping over the gathered crowd. When she raised her hand, the entire square suddenly fell silent, thousands of people breathing as one. Her voice rang out clear and resolute, each word striking like a hammer against the memory of all present. "No one is barred from the door of justice." The statement echoed, cutting through the sky like thunder, leaving a tremor in the heart of every person. In that moment, banners lifted higher, cheers erupted and merged again into the rhythm rhythm of pounding drums. People at the front line joined hands. Those in the back danced, transforming the square into a human ocean in which every individual felt part of a shared legacy. The elderly nodded, the young shouted, and children sitting on their parents' shoulders clapped in rhythm, creating an image that would not be forgotten. Every gaze was fixed on the woman standing on the platform, not in idolization, but in collective trust in the words she had just affirmed. In each following sentence, she spoke not of herself, nor of the pain she had endured, but focused on the essential truth that justice must be accessible to all, regardless of skin color, origin, or status. She reminded them that a society only truly exists when the law protects the most vulnerable, because only then does fairness gain lasting value. If one person is barred from justice, then all of us are, she said, and the roar from the crowd below surged upward in powerful reply. Peace blanketed the atmosphere, yet its force was stronger than any confrontation. People no longer clung to hatred, only to the sense of duty to carry forward the promise that had just been lit. Overhead, the church bell rang out, joining the applause in a final anthem to a journey that had been hard but burned bright with hope. Journalists and reporters captured the moment, though no pen seemed capable of fully conveying it. Faces in the crowd lit up every smile and every glance, a silent pledge to the future. Within the judge's heart, a profound stillness spread as if she had passed on her final legacy to the people. No more words were needed, for the chant, "Justice for all," still echoed, blending with the sound of the bells, repeating itself as if etched into the collective memory. And then, as she stepped back, making way for the crowd to raise their voices together, the square transformed into a living symbol of justice, the kind she had devoted her entire life to protecting. In the radiant sunlight, that story closed, but its resonance continued to spread like a torch that would never burn out. The church bells rang out from afar, their sound, blending with thunderous applause, creating a chorus both sacred and ablaze with belief. The chimes were no longer just the familiar sound of religious ritual, but now the shared heartbeat of thousands unified by a single ideal. In that sea of people, each clap was a promise, each shining gaze a candle, lighting the vast square. No one had to say a word yet. All understood that this moment would become a collective memory, a marker of a community's transformation. The female judge stood in silence, listening to the sounds, sensing a resonance no longer divided by class status or skin color. She knew the journey they had just taken from being shut out at the gates to affirming justice in front of a crowd had left an indelible mark on every citizen. The bells ringing above were like confirmation that every sacrifice, every scar, every bitter confrontation had not been in vain. She gently closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in like a final chapter in the book that society had just written together. As the bells slowly faded into the air, the deep blue sky appeared through a veil of thin clouds, like the last curtain being drawn back to reveal an open future. The chants continued, but now steadier, no longer urgent, more like the firm steps of a new path ahead. In that light, their faces reflected not just anger or outrage, but belief and pride in having stood up. The entire square became a living portrait of unity, where justice was no longer an abstract concept, but a reality held in every heart. The story did not end with a dry conclusion, but with the harmony of bells and applause, with the unity of thousands who had witnessed and taken part. The legacy left behind was not simply one person's victory, but a lesson for an entire generation. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the act of stepping forward despite it, facing it and overcoming it. Justice is not a gift bestowed, but the result of struggle, of collective belief and unyielding will. In the eyes of children sitting on their parents' shoulders, and the smiles of elders who had lived through many ups and downs, and the unified chants of the youth, that legacy was etched deep. It would be passed on, not merely through textbooks, but through living memory, through stories told over family dinners, through reminders reminders that there was once a day when an entire community stood together to declare justice a shared right. And from today on, no matter where life leads each individual, the sound of church bells mingled with that applause will continue to echo, reminding them that the doors of justice are always open to those brave enough to walk through. In the moment when bells rang in harmony with the thunderous applause sweeping across the square, the story of the female judge and her journey through darkness came to an end. But its echo did not remain a single event. From that gloomy morning outside the courthouse when she was stopped with words of disdain to the moment she stood on a platform before thousands, her journey was a chain of events that exposed the truth and affirmed belief. It was not merely a confrontation between a woman and an abusive officer, but a lasting reminder that justice always needs protectors, hearts willing to step out of silence and confront oppression. The story unfolded into many layers of meaning, exposing the nature of power when abused, revealing fractures within systems that once seemed unshakable, and more importantly, showing the power of truth when it spreads. A punch in the courtroom, a leaked video, or a firm public statement all became sparks that lit the fire of justice across community. No one imagined that such a bitter confrontation could ignite such a vast movement for change, stirring public outcry, prompting societal reflection, and prompting the world to speak up in unison. But if it had stopped at outrage, the story would not have endured. What gave it lasting power was how it became a lesson. In classrooms, students debated the limits and responsibilities of power. In public squares, justice for all signs became living declaration. At international conferences, it became a textbook example in the fight against discrimination and injustice. And in a small room at sunset, when the female judge passed her story on to the young, like a torch that was when a personal legacy became the shared legacy of an entire generation. The lesson left behind does not lie in the downfall of an abuser of power, but in the collective strength of a community rising together. Justice is no longer a concept confined to paper, but a force that can reshape society when fueled by perseverance and courage. Every individual, regardless of position, can contribute to preserving and spreading it, from a student recording a video, a witness daring to speak the truth, to everyday people holding signs in the street. It is the connection between these small acts that creates meaningful change. Looking back on the entire journey, the most inspiring moment was not the verdict or the applause of the crowd, but the image of the female judge refusing to bow her head to humiliation from the very beginning. Because from that unwavering stance, everything else began to unfold, leading to an outcome no one could deny. Courage is not a grand gesture, but the choice to stand tall in adversity so that a single voice carries more weight than 1,000 silences. And that very courage is the root of all transformation, the mark that lasts in history. The story comes to a close, but the sound of bells and applause in the square still echoes as an unending reminder. The greatest legacy it leaves is the belief that justice belongs to everyone, that anyone can be the one to light that torch for the next generation. And in every place, from classrooms buzzing with debate to streets lined with banners, the presence of the female judge and all she stands for still lingers as proof that courage and justice always walk hand in hand and never fade away.